Today's assembly is devoted to the observance of Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day in Australia is dedicated to the Australians who died as a result of war, particularly from World War I onwards. Sunday the 11th of November marks 100 years since representatives of France, Britain and Germany signed a document that brought an end to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Could you all please stand? Sorry. The Lord's Prayer is recited by School Vice Captain Maddie Tate in English and Min Nguyen in Vietnamese.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Lạy Cha chúng con ở trên trời, chúng con nguyện danh Cha cả sáng.
Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven.
Nước Cha trị đến, ý Cha thể hiện dưới đất cũng như trên trời.
Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us.
Xin Cha cho chúng con hôm nay lương thực hàng ngày và Cha nợ chúng con như chúng con cũng tha kẻ có nợ.
Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Xin chớ để chúng con xa trước cám dỗ.
For the kingdom, the power and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
Cũng như chúng con cho khỏi sự dữ. Amen.
Katie Knapp will talk about what Remembrance Day means to her.
"100 years ago, at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, all gunshots stopped on the Western Front in Europe and everything went silent. After 4 years of continuous fighting, German leaders signed an armistice, or what was essentially an unconditional surrender, ending World War I. During the Great War, which was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, 60,000 Australians were killed at a time when Australia's population was only 5 million. That's more than 1 in every 100 Australians killed during the war. If you look around this wonderful theatre, that is a small example of the freedom and opportunities won for us by those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Ever since I was born, my parents have been taking me on Anzac Day to the dawn service at the Marion Return Services League, where our school leaders lay a wreath at the cenotaph. My parents take me there because they want me to appreciate what the day means. But once I would complain about getting up on these often cold and dark mornings, I now gladly do so, despite it making me sad thinking about all of the soldiers who across the generations lost their lives fighting for our freedom. Like my family, most Australians rightly put a heavy focus on Anzac Day, the tragedy of Gallipoli and the coming of a nation, both the remembrance and the varied activities on this public holiday. Remembrance Day, however, is a more sombre commemoration that we share with all participating countries of World War I, particularly in Europe. For me, it is a time again to reflect on those who lost their lives fighting for our country in Australia's first and bloodiest major war. As both of my parents served in the regular army for over 20 years, I am very grateful that they were lucky enough never to experience the horrors of war. Unfortunately, many families were not as lucky as mine, with family members either badly injured, killed, or traumatised while serving our nation. I think of those soldiers so young that they didn't even get to finish school, and families who've lost loved ones at war, and for those kids who never got to see their mum or dad again. During the 2 minutes of silence, at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month, I urge you, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, to also remember the sacrifices made. I urge you to appreciate how those sacrifices contributed to this great country. I urge you to continue to be proud of those who serve in our defence forces, including my parents.
The school choir, under the direction of the school, will now sing on Flanders Fields. Flanders Fields was an area in France where intense fighting took place during World War I.
In Flanders
Today we have an invited guest attending our Remembrance Day Assembly, Wing Commander Marcus Watson. Wing Commander Watson joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1993 and graduated from the Australian Defence Force Academy in 1995, the Bachelor of Arts, Management and Information Systems from the University of New South Wales. He graduated as an Air Force pilot in 1997 and completed operational conversion to the P-3C Orion Maritime Patrol aircraft in 1998, followed by many operational deployments in Southeast Asia, including as part of the United Nations Force East Timor. Following 4 deployments to the Middle East, including flying operations in support of forces in Iraq and the region, Wing Commander Watson moved into a capability support role, overseeing technology upgrades to the AP-3 Orion aircraft fleet. For his efforts in the role, he was awarded an Air Commander Australia Commendation. Promoted to Squadron Leader and serving in a liaison role in Navy Fleet Headquarters, Wing Commander Watson returned to flying in a supervisory and leadership role, culminating in his appointment as Executive Officer of No. 10 Squadron, one of the 3 Air Force squadrons operating the AP-3C Orion aircraft. Wing Commander Watson was selected to be the Military Assistant to Deputy Chief of Joint Operations during 2016, and last year he attended the New Zealand Defence Force Command and Staff College. Wing Commander Watson graduated from the college at Massey University of New Zealand with a Master of International Security and was the first international student to be awarded Dux of Course. Wing Commander Watson is the Deputy Director of Operational Airworthiness for the Royal Australian Air Force, responsible for ensuring the safe and efficient operations of all Air Force aircraft. Wing Commander Watson completed Year 12 here at Westminster in 1991 as a school leader and Vice Captain of Frigate House. It is my pleasure to invite Wing Commander Watson to address our Remembrance Day Assembly.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to be back here at Westminster School, and inasmuch as many things do change, some things don't appear to change, and Grant Block appears not to have aged a year since the day I left. I'd like to know where all those grey hairs are going. May I start my address today by acknowledging the Kaurna traditional owners of the country we meet on and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. E te rangatira, tēnā koe. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Principal, teachers, staff and fellow students. I say fellow students because I consider myself a perpetual student in life and also a proud student from Westminster. In introducing this address, I provided both an acknowledgement of country, recognising Indigenous connection to our land, and also a Maori greeting in their language of Te Reo. Principal Simon Shepherd, you are the rangatira, or Maori chief, that I acknowledge as chief here today. As a symbol of your office, I present you with a mere ponamu, a chief's weapon made from ponamu stone, which is a very precious green stone found only in South Island of New Zealand. You may hold this for today, but I'll take it back before I leave. I got that last year while I was in New Zealand. More importantly, I also want to acknowledge the combined sacrifice of New Zealand and Australian women and men, Aboriginal and Maori, during the bloody conflicts of the First World War. Remembrance Day this Sunday will mark 100 years since the armistice of the Western Front and the end of the First World War. As we remind ourselves each year, at this hour on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent. 4 years of war had come to an end. Sunday in Australia also marks the end of the centenary of Anzac commemorations, which began in 2014 to commemorate the commencement of the First World War and subsequent Anzac military campaign. The theme for the centenary of Anzac is "Their Spirit Lives." But what does that mean to us today? And more importantly, what does that mean for you in the future? In 2009, the then Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, General James Mattis, who is currently the Secretary of Defence for the United States, stated that despite advances in technology since the First World War, and I quote, "the fundamental nature of war remains unchanged. It is a human endeavour, fraught with peril, fear, passion and unpredictability." Therefore, acknowledging these key aspects of war can assist us to understand the reasons for war, the effects of war, and most importantly, how to avoid war. Remembrance Day allows us to pause and commemorate those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice and to understand why they fought, and most importantly, to learn from the experience. The First World War became known as the Great War, and for good reason, and we've heard some excellent information before I stood up today, so I apologise if I do repeat some of the statistics, but they are staggering. The scale of the war was unprecedented. Across the world, it sparked the mobilisation of 70 million people across many nations. Its violence shattered great empires. There are simply some countries in existence before the war that simply failed to be in existence after the war. Its images have never lost their power. To a great degree, those images of the muddy moonscapes of the Western Front have served to define for succeeding generations the horror of war. It was the costliest conflict in history up to that time. 13 million people across the world died, 9 million of them combatants in war. Over 1/3 of the soldiers killed were missing, or simply had no known graves. In Australia, 332,000 Australians fought in the Great War, with the 1st Australian Imperial Force, or AIF. 60,000 of those died, 45,000 of them on the Western Front, and 152,000 were wounded. Those grim statistics meant that only 1 out of every 3 Australians who went to war got through it unscathed, at least physically. With a population of only about 4 million, Australia had proportionate forces fielded, the highest casualties in the British Empire. For the Australians at the front, the armistice, the end of the war, came as a reprieve. Not for them, though, the celebrations that erupted in the cities of Australia and the other victorious Allied nations as the news spread. Too many of their mates had been killed. One sits and ponders sadly of those many pals who are gone to that home from which no wanderer returns, lamented Corporal Roger Morgan of the 2nd Battalion. As the men of the 1st AIF had no home leave almost until the end of the war, they consigned thoughts of home and family to the back of the mind, and a man's mates became his chief reason for being. For all the dreadful implications of war, it is something to have known men as they truly are, wrote Captain Edgar Rule of the 14th Battalion. Men would rather die than let a mate down, observed the Australian official historian Charles Bean. Mateship and the deep loyalty it bred gave the AIF the strength to endure the terrible ordeal. It was embodied in the early days on Gallipoli by Private John Simpson Kilpatrick, who you may have heard of, who brought down wounded from the line on a donkey until he was killed barely a month after he arrived on the peninsula. It was expressed by Trooper Humphrey Hassel of the 10th Light Horse, who was quoted as saying, "Goodbye, Cobber, I don't think I'll be coming back from this one," he said before charging to certain death. On the Western Front, on Gallipoli and in the desert, the Australians encountered the mass killing power of modern industrial warfare. But in battle after battle, it was not powerful enough to threaten the bonds of mateship that held them together. At Fromelles in France, where over 5,500 Australians became casualties in a single night, their mates scoured no man's land, that area between the German and Allied forces, for days afterwards to recover their wounded. At Pozières, where the Australians withstood some of the heaviest prolonged artillery shelling of the war, Private Edward Jenkins, a renowned troublemaker in the 3rd Battalion, brought in the wounded and gave them his water until an exploding shell obliterated him. At Polygon Wood, Captain Harold Wanless of the 14th Battalion, who many viewed as a potential future Australian Prime Minister, was killed while trying to help a wounded man. A famous Bible passage captures this spirit. It says, "A man has no greater love than this, than he lays down his life for his friends." Few would disagree with it. I think there is a corollary that few would disagree with either. It is this: a man has no greater love for his country than that he lays down his life on its behalf. Australia's First World War dead fell for a cause that some people today criticise as futile, as having little to do with Australia. The men of the first AIF knew otherwise. They knew that if the struggle were lost, then Australia would be a very different place. They knew that future Australians would not be able to rejoice that their country was free and their destiny theirs to determine. They knew that tyranny successful somewhere, anywhere, eroded freedom everywhere. Volunteers all, they fought and died to prevent that happening. Although, and through the pivotal role that the Australian Corps played in the advance to victory on the Western Front in 1918, Australia influenced the destiny of the world for the first time in our history, and arguably more than at any other time since. The First World War was supposed to have ended all wars. The 100 years since the armistice bear eloquent and sad testimony to how illusory that hope was. Those years have seen war after war, campaign after campaign, and thousands more Australian war dead. But in every instance, those Australians held to the same twin ideals: mates and country, mates and country, as those who went before them. Let me mention a few. The Air Force, terribly wounded by anti-aircraft fire over Italy during the Second World War, Pilot Officer Rawdon Middleton, one mission away from completing his tour and returning home, flew his crippled bomber aircraft all the way back to England and held it steady while his crew parachuted to safety. He knew he could not escape himself. Middleton was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. Lieutenant Tom Diver Derrick of the 2nd 48th Battalion had already won the Victoria Cross in New Guinea and the Distinguished Conduct Medal in the Western Desert. Already well known in Australia, he was withdrawn from combat in 1944, but insisted on returning to action with his mates in Borneo in May 1945. There, with the end of the war in sight, he was killed. Leap ahead 20 years to 1965 in the jungles of Vietnam. Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher Wheatley of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam refused to leave a wounded mate and died in action alongside him. Dasher Wheatley was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. In the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency, and during confrontation, Australians also gave their lives for mates and country. Like their forebears in earlier conflicts, they were determined not to let either down. Our war dead are scattered across far-flung lands. They lie in over 100 cemeteries, or are remembered on just as many memorials. Their names, more than 102,000 of them, are on the roll of honour that lines the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and also countless war memorials all over Australia and New Zealand. Today we have members of the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces currently working alongside Allied forces in faraway lands such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and the Philippines, continuing the fight against international terrorism. It is a war that we and our allies must win, but the road to victory will be a long one. We also remember today as well those currently serving in Japan and South Korea to monitor and enforce United Nations sanctions against North Korea, and those involved in joint security arrangements with our regional neighbours in Southeast Asia. Other Australian servicemen and women have died in commitments that were not warlike, such as peacekeeping or humanitarian operations, or as members of post-conflict occupation forces. While the type of commitment may differ, the outcome remains ultimately a human endeavour. Every one of the names on the roll of honour you see on each and every war memorial in New Zealand and Australia represents a husband, father, son or brother taken, a wife, mother, daughter or sister gone. Their lives were precious to their families, to Australia and New Zealand, and above all, to those who gave them. They never had the chance to grow old or to watch those dear to them grow old. Their loss is a reminder that there is nothing glorious about war. Those called upon to fight know better than anyone. But they also know that when all else fails, it is necessary to fight against the tyrannies that threaten liberty. That cause transcends the ages, and it is a noble one. So we also recall today those who have fallen for our allies in fighting for it with us. It is highly appropriate that we should gather together today to commemorate, to understand, and most importantly, to learn. In writing of our war dead, Charles Bean said of the Australian War Memorial, "Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved." It is there and in every memorial, no matter how small, that we sense their presence. It is there that their call to us to build a nation worthy of their sacrifice is heard at its loudest. In these days of great uncertainty, those words are a clarion call for all Australians and New Zealanders. Strengthened by those pillars of mateship and country that sustained them and led them, as ordinary Australians and New Zealanders, to achieve great things, we must not let them down, lest we forget.
On behalf of the school, we would like to thank Wing Commander Watson with a small token of appreciation.
I now have the pleasure of inviting Sasha Mutsi and Cara Sallin to the stage to the oath of remembrance.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
mark the signing of armistice of World War I. Right across the country, Australian pipers and bands will play the Battle Over Cry, the tune composed a century ago to honour those who served and to this day is regularly played by bands the world over. We are indeed fortunate to have our very own resident musicians here to perform the Battle Over as part of our Remembrance Day service. Please welcome Daniel and Mr. Shepherd.